Okay. Karin.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I realised this morning that this wasn't a great day to be doing a talk. If anybody has been up like me since 3:30 this morning watching the TV, I'll understand if you droop halfway through. Okay, so today we're going to be focusing particularly on how academics learn to write. This is part of a bigger project on academics' writing practices, which we're going to tell you about in a bit more detail. But for today, our focus is on this question of how academics learn to write. Why are we interested in writing? We're interested in writing because writing is at the heart of everything that academics do, really. The project as a whole is interested in how writing is changing within the changing context of higher education. Higher education, as you well know, has undergone quite significant transformations over the past 5, 10 years, maybe longer. This is within the context of political changes which have focused on changing from higher education as an elite system to higher education as a mass system catering for the purported needs of the emerging knowledge-based economy, meaning student numbers have gone up and the kind of overall goals of higher education have changed in relation to that. And a range of different transformations in universities have led to changes in what academics are expected to do, the kinds of commitments academics are expected to make, the ways in which academics are evaluated. All of these have an effect on and can be examined through focusing on people's writing practices. I should say we gave a talk here a couple of weeks ago which started with a similar set of slides. Don't worry, after the first 2 or 3 slides, if you're at both talks, they do change. So some of the key transformations which kind of shape what we're looking at have been to do with how academics' work is managed, introduction of practices of evaluation in which academics are made accountable for, primarily accountable for their research outputs with the research evaluation frameworks that have actually been in place since 1986 but grow increasingly high priority as the years go on, and an increasing likelihood of similar evaluations being introduced for teaching. A much higher percentage of academics working in insecure jobs, and increasing concern with academics' workloads, intensification of work, what's known as the accelerated academy, with academics being expected to produce writing at a higher and higher pace. Another big change has been the digital revolution in the past, again, 10, 15 years or so. The kinds of tools which academics use for their writing have changed very fundamentally. This doesn't just mean the things that you think of when you think about writing, kind of word processors, databases, those kinds of things, but also teaching, which used to be a predominantly face-to-face activity, is now increasingly mediated through things like Moodle and Blackboard and other kinds of virtual learning environments. So it becomes increasingly about communicating through writing and other kinds of multimodal communication. We have access to a vast array of knowledge resources online now, which didn't used to be the case, and there's an argument that this is changing the nature of scholarship, that the kinds of skills and practices that academics need for carrying out research are very different now that we have access to this wide array of resources without ever leaving our computers. And finally, we don't even have to be at a computer to engage in these kinds of digital communications, because everyone, or the vast majority of academics, can now be accessed at all times through the medium of a phone or a tablet, which keys you right into the ongoing influx of digital communication that we have to deal with on a daily basis. So all of these changes lead to a range of pressures, a range of tensions that people need to negotiate. People need to work out how to be accountable to these kinds of external standards. They need to figure out how, in order to meet the demands of things like the REF, how and where to publish, what kinds of things to publish in ways that achieve both the external norms against which they're evaluated and their own personal intellectual goals and the expectations of their discipline. And those three things are not always in sync. The people need to respond to expectations about social media, about having a public face online, probably in a range of different locations, all of which are associated with a particular set of practices they have to learn, and the kinds of teaching platforms I mentioned also take time to learn. So all of these changes lead to learning demands. Being an academic and engaging in all the different kinds of writing demands that academics engage in it intrinsically requires people to learn and adapt continually. So that's our focus today. Within this changing environment, with this range of tensions and pressures, how do people learn to engage in the very many different types of writing practices which they do in their everyday professional lives? So we're going to be talking about different kinds of writing practices, not just research writing, the wide range of different genres people are engaging in. We're going to be pulling out various approaches people adopt to learning and acquiring these new writing practices, and at the end we're going to identify some common patterns. All of this is drawing on, as I said, data from our project, which is a 2-year project called Dynamics of Knowledge Creation, Academics Writing in the Contemporary University Workplace. The project is in its final few funded months now. On the project team we have myself, Ibrar, Sharon, Dee, and David Barton and Mary Hamilton, who are not here today. They're in Cambodia, which is probably a good thing. We're interested in the project as a whole. We have broad interest, but the research questions that we're pursuing are quite broad. We're looking, for instance, at how academics' writing practices are shaped by the socio-material aspects of their professional lives. They're looking at the tools and resources and networks that people are drawing on. We're interested in digital communications technologies. We're interested in managerial practices. And the big overarching question is to what extent are academic, scholarly, professional identities being shaped, produced, changed by these aspects of their writing practices. The theoretical framework is combining literacy studies, where we're interested in the kinds of reading and writing people are actually doing, and the purposes and values and histories associated with their writing practices, rather than looking at skills that people should have, and also drawing on socio-material theories within education. There's some references there. All of these kinds of theoretical resources frame writing as an embodied practice, embodied material practice, which we've been investigating by working closely with individuals across a range of different universities and a range of different disciplines. The research design, this table represents numbers of interviews we currently have in the database rather than numbers of people. We've worked in two research-intensive universities, one of them a campus university and one of them a city-based university, an urban university, and one post-92 teaching intensive institution. And we've worked with people in a STEM discipline. We pick maths to kind of be, I won't say to represent STEM disciplines, but as a STEM discipline. Marketing as a kind of professional applied discipline, and history as a humanities discipline. And in each of the slots in that table, we've worked closely. In the vast majority of them, we've worked closely with 2 people. A few of them we've got 1, and 1 or 2 of them we've got 3. We actually have more interviews than that in our data set. We've got 90-odd interview transcripts there at the moment, but that also includes pilot work that we've done in social sciences disciplines and a autoethnographic work where we've been interviewing one another and reflecting on our own practices. And we're still collecting data, so it will be more than that at the end. Just to give you an outline of our different data collection methodologies. It's been in 3 phases. In phase 1, we were working very closely with these individual academics, carrying out repeated interviews of different kinds. So the first interview we did was a walk-around interview, where people walked us around their working space while giving us a kind of overview of their working role and working practices. The second one was a technobiography, in which people reflected on their history of writing and the different tools and technologies that they had drawn on throughout their writing history, taking tools and technologies in its broadest sense. And the third one, a day in the life interview, where we asked people to look back over their diaries and go into detail about the specific kinds of writing that they'd done on a particular day or a particular set of recent days. The second phase involved really detailed collection of data on their writing processes using screen capture and keyboard logging and research field notes over the space of between 1 and 2 hours of writing to see how what people told us about their writing matched what they were actually doing when they were writing. We discovered that actually people spent an awful lot of time searching for things and looking through emails. And phase 3, where we're at the moment, is broadening out from those focal individuals and interviewing colleagues, administrative staff, managerial staff, testing out our understandings from the first 2 phases and understanding the context in which people are working. And all of this data has been, as Steve said, loaded into Atlas TI and analysed primarily thematically following the research questions that I outlined earlier. That gives you a brief run-through of the project. I'll hand over to Ibrar now to start talking about the data in a bit more depth.
Hi everyone. So as Karin has mentioned, here we're going to present one dimension of our project's findings, the dimension that points to how our academic participants learn to get to grips with their writing activities in their daily life, in their professional life. And so there's a few ways to break this down. There's the what of academics writing, the genres and the text types. And then there's the how, meaning how the academic participants in our study learn to get to grips with a particular form of writing. And there isn't a direct link between the what and the how. And the academics we worked with used a mixture of approaches to learn the different kinds of writing that they do at work. So this talk addresses some of the whats and then subsequently draws out some of the hows as we go along, and then we revisit the hows and the learning theories at the end. So in the interviews we found that people mention a wide range of writing activities, and we counted over 60 kinds of writing tasks involving different texts, procedures and kinds of collaborations with others, including writing with academic and administrative colleagues, funding bodies, editors, publishers, etc. Most of our participants told us that their research falls into 3 main areas, which won't surprise you: teaching, research and admin. But we also heard a lot from our participants about another kind of writing that's a little bit more voluntary or optional. So we call this service writing. And what's important, and importantly for this kind of writing, it's very outward facing, and it's not usually part of a nominal percentage of academic working time. So we found So in terms of research writing, when it came to research writing, this is what people talked about the most, even though we didn't specifically ask them about research writing. We began asking them about writing in general, and most of our participants will start talking about research writing as almost like a default mode of answer. So although people's initial focus was on journal articles and monographs, as we delved deeper, we discovered a lot more. And this diagram loosely arranges them in a kind of chronological fashion, with the list on the left being the kinds of writing that was undertaken before research was carried out. In the middle, that's the kind of writing that was undertaken during research, and on the right, there's the glossed and finished pieces of work that we are very much familiar with. So, proposal writing, applications for funding, ethics forms, etc. are on the left. In the middle, you've got slightly more messier forms of writing, like field notes and coding and communicating with research participants and emailing and around that, and the transcription work associated with research. And at the end, you've got the commonly understood outputs of academic writing. Interestingly, for the STEM disciplines, this was sometimes about producing software as an output. And working in the humanities disciplines, monographs were the standard, and sometimes poems, as well as the more prototypical journal articles. We even have film script in that list as well. So, how did our participants learn the kinds of writing required to undertake their research? It's said by many people that the PhD is an apprenticeship into the academic life. So maybe that's a useful place to start. Now, one of our research methods, as Karin mentioned, is a technobiographic interview. One of the things I like about the technobiographic interview is that it draws out the subjective experience of the participant, their life history, their experience with writing and technology throughout their career and throughout their life. And so people naturally talked about their PhD in their technobios that we did. So it's in those interviews that the PhD was discussed. And Charles's quote here is quite interesting, because it's indicative of the kinds of responses we had. That learning to write for research begins with the ongoing supervisor feedback during the PhD process. So the quote reinforces much of what we say later on. But as you can see from Diane's quote here, even the learning of writing that's associated with the PhD did not arise purely from the formal aspect of the PhD program, but from an informal aspect of it, i.e., not from the feedback gained from her supervisor. So for Diane, here, feedback from a peer at a similar stage was just as important, perhaps even more important, than the formal feedback she got from her supervisor in her conceptualization of her own writing development. So where her supervisor's feedback stopped her from writing, her colleagues' feedback freed her up to write. And you will see this through this talk, that this pattern continued throughout people's working lives. The salience of connections and collaborations in learning to write in academia is central to our findings in terms of learning to write. And learning from others is central to that kind of collaboration. As Mark here outlines, he says, I haven't done any formal training. What I have done is work with people who are more intelligent and more capable than me, more experienced than me, and worked with them and learned from them. So it's been more of an apprenticeship rather than a formal sit in a classroom type thing. So when our participants spoke in more general terms about learning to write for research purposes throughout their professional lives, we saw consistency among them in that they described writing for research as primarily something that they learn through their peer network, or through peer review as well, mentoring, collaborative work, or some sort of combination of these, and not through formal training, a kind of apprenticeship, as Mark describes it. Now, formal training is something that we'll come to later, but here it's worth pointing out that Mark, like many academics working in the field of marketing, has had an established career in business before coming to academia. So rather than relying on formal training, he relies on his ability to make successful contacts and nurture the right kind of collaborations that help him write as an academic. Another aspect of this is learning from expertise. So effective networking as part of learning to write was also echoed by other participants in the research. Gareth, the mathematician, says, it's nice to be able to work with people who maybe are more experienced intellectually. There's a guidance and learning of what works. And then Colin also speaks favourably about his collaborations, the few that he's done. One of the key aspects of learning from others was when people described the benefits of learning from other people's expertise, and not just the benefits, but the pleasure. A lot of participants used words like enjoy, nice, and fun, and there was a very positive affective relationship with the people whom they had collaborated with and subsequently learned from. People speak very positively about the people they write with and learn from, and quite negatively about the kinds of collaborations that didn't work. Personal connections featured as very important in the learning process. As I mentioned earlier, the peer review process was considered as a kind of training, if not a formal one. And Diane's quote here echoes that. Learning academic writing involves getting to grips with the conventions of quality, rigor, academic style, and fine-tuning an argument. Submitting something to a journal is more than that, as our participants talked about familiarizing with the communities of practice surrounding particular journals in order to speak to those communities in order to get published. People spoke a lot about the importance of feedback on their writing for developing these skills. The formal process of peer review is one aspect of this. And Diane here talks about the peer review process as the training. That was the training for her. But more informal, ongoing feedback from authors was also talked about a lot, as Charles talks about here. But as we know, collaborating doesn't always work out, and learning is sometimes painful. A less than positive experience can also be a form of learning. A less than positive experience of collaborating can also be a kind of learning, because you learn who not to collaborate with, if you know what I mean. So here, what I've done is I've drawn out a longer example of Emma, who's an academic in marketing, whose experience of learning to write research papers has been a bit troubling. So I thought I'd pull it out here for you. The thing with Emma is that since being employed, she hasn't developed the relevant networks to write the way she feels she ought to, and in the manner that is required for her probation for her university. This is something that's troubled her since her PhD, since completing her PhD and getting employed. She talks about her collaborating experience as one where she has to write a paper end to end, then have it taken apart by a collaborator, sent back to her, and then she has to rewrite it. But she's tried to deal with this thorny way of collaborating by developing her own networks. She says, I've just met at a conference two other women who are at the very same career stage as me. There's a special issue that we've decided to try and pull a paper together on, and we seem to come from a similar point of view. So for her, it's about nurturing the right kind of networks relevant to her career stage, so that she can subsequently learn and develop her writing skills. And other participants also talked about how they learn the structure and style of academic publishing through feedback gained through collaborations, sometimes painfully. Overlapping partly with the aspect of collaboration is learning by doing. Possibly the most important approach to learning research writing described by our participants was actually getting stuck in and learning to write by actually doing it yourself. by simply engaging in the acts of writing themselves. The best way to learn to write a research proposal is to actually start writing one and get feedback on it. And Michael here says, by collaborating with people who had the craft, by talking to people who are successful, by trying my own things, by failing in quite a few others, and by learning where to direct my energies, by looking at different styles of writing, different journals, different communities and so on, that was my training. There was nothing formal about it. It was very much like how you learned any other kind of craft. But we felt that this is a certain mindset that not everybody can adopt. And one aspect of this is what summed up well by Diane, who says that she had to learn by doing, by keeping her bum on the seat. She found writing retreats invaluable in learning how to do this. I'll just let you read that quote. Whereas Michael, in the previous slide, adopted a different strategy. In the project itself, we've had a writing retreat, and the feedback that we've had from that has been really interesting, because one of the things we found is that during the retreat, we found that during the retreat how much the group had in common, despite our different disciplinary and institutional contexts, with academics struggling to find uninterrupted stretches of time and headspace in which to write. Several of the participants in our writing retreat also spoke about trying to organise something similar in their own departments and research groups, echoing Diane's idea of the regimen here.
Okay, so I'm going to move on now and talk about some of the other types of writing in a little bit less detail. So we've seen that learning research writing involves learning a really wide range of genres, through working with other people, through getting feedback and reflecting on feedback, and through learning by doing. So how about teaching? Teaching is an area where there's been more and more interest in recent years in making sure that the quality of teaching is monitored and assessed, that it's been increasingly professionalised in the university in recent years. So what do people tell us about teaching? It's a role which also involves a wide range of written genres, and we've got some of the genres that people mentioned here, again arranged loosely chronologically into before teaching, during the face-to-face portion of teaching, for face-to-face teaching, and after teaching. And in the before chunk in particular, there has been increasing demand on academics to produce written representations of their teaching, which then go to other bodies, committees at various levels for increasingly formal assessment, and mastering those genres and the particular institutional requirements of the course proposal, the chunk for the course handbook, whether the chunk for the course handbook has to look the same as the chunk which goes on the web, or whether it has to look different, whether that's changed from the year before. All of those things are part of the ongoing professional learning that academics do. Some of these forms of writing are actually becoming increasingly starting to look more like marketing texts. Some of the course descriptions and scheme descriptions are not just about communicating to students what it is they're going to do, but also play a role in recruiting students to the university, and so can get scrutinised by different parts of the administration, putting different sets of demands on people. During the teaching writing, more directly pedagogical texts, if you like, course notes and lecture notes and handouts and writings on blackboard and those kinds of things. These aren't new genres in the same way as some of the before ones that I mentioned, but equally with the shift to increasing distance, blended learning, academics are having to learn how to produce these kinds of genres in new ways, for distribution in new ways. And then we have some genres which we've put as after, mainly associated with assessment, feedback to students, marking exams, those kinds of things. And again, these take different kinds of forms depending on institutional procedures, and these can change depending on central decisions. So what do people tell us about how they learned the kinds of writing for teaching that they were doing? Well, actually, it was in many ways quite similar to what we found about writing for research, in that learning by doing was really the predominant characteristic. An awful lot of responses in our data, when people talked about learning to do their writing for teaching, they talked about learning from experience, doing it, reflecting on it, thinking about what works, as Josh says in this quote, looking at what's been written, thinking about it, thinking, will people understand it, reflecting back on it, and learning from students' responses. Josh went on to say, being new to distance learning in particular, student responses to what was going up on the VLE were really important in shaping the way he went on to develop his teaching writing. He's been quite responsive to what the students are saying. Most of the participants, certainly most of the newer participants in our data, had participated in some kind of formal training for teaching in higher education, but actually they spoke very little about that formal training when they talked about how they'd learned the writing that was associated with teaching. It was far more about learning by doing it and learning from feedback, in this case from students. Going on to administrative writing, which we split administrative writing into two kinds. The kind of admin writing that one is required to do for the institution or for the department, or that relate in some way to formalised administrative roles, which we have under the institutional list there. But then people also told us about kind of personal administration, self-organisation, expenses claims, to-do lists, personal thoughts, your own notes from meetings, those kinds of things. Again, lots and lots of different types of writing fell into this category. And as Ibrar mentioned, we also had the category of service, which were for things which related to roles that were outside one's own institutional role, things like sitting on committees, being involved in journal editing, external examining, things that wouldn't be counted in a workload model, but are nevertheless an important part of people's professional lives. This sort of work can take up quite a lot of people's time, and again involves a certain amount of learning how to do new things, but doesn't appear in people's job descriptions, but nevertheless is often important when it comes to promotion and recognition. So it's quite interesting to see how much of the learning of these kinds of genres arises simply from people's experience, learning by experience. We had quite a few participants who either were or had been head of department or had a kind of high-level managerial role, and even at this relatively senior level, most of the learning that people talked about doing was learning by doing, learning by experience. So in Colin's quote here, he says he had no formal training for everything that he had to do in terms of managing the department. It was a bit of a roller coaster time, and the things he achieved, it was by dint of learning on the job. The kinds of administrative tasks and people management tasks associated with being a head of department are increasingly complex. One of the people we spoke to explained, I have to do this job for 5 years, not 3. Who would have been expected to do it for 3. I have to do it for 5 years because the first 3 I've just been learning what I can't do. Now I need to feel what I can do. That's not to say that people engaged in these high-level administrative roles aren't offered formal training. There is formal training. So Gareth explains that when he became the head of department, he did go to formal training courses offered by the university. But he says he thought the university didn't quite get it right because the things that he actually felt he needed support with were about people management, things like how to communicate effectively with people, when to speak to people face-to-face, when to send an email, how to frame the email. Those kinds of things were the things that he was needing to learn, whereas the training courses focused very much on process and on logistics. The kinds of more formal programs people said they had benefited from were in this kind of area were more the kind of leadership programs which brought many people together in similar roles where they were able to learn from each other. Signalling again the importance of learning from other people's expertise. I'm very interested in the kinds of personal administrative writing that people do, because that's a very hidden kind of writing. And being an academic, okay, so we're managing this enormous range of different genres, different tasks, different roles, different timescales, things that have to be done tomorrow, things that have to be done in 5 years' time, big jobs, small jobs. How do people learn how to manage that? That usually involves some kind of writing. Everybody we spoke to had some kind of system for managing these kinds of personal administrative roles, but everybody's system was different. In this quote, the interviewer had asked about to-do lists, specifically about to-do lists. You have to-do lists. And Juliet explains, okay, well, yes, I have post-its, and I go through these post-it notes every day. Then I've got a longer-term to-do list thingy. You can see the informality of the way it's characterized. So a longer-term one, and then one for the day, and then one for the week. So lots of to-do lists for the things I have to keep on my mind, and you can see how she's using the different lists for different time scales. But then there are the things which really have to be done today, which are different from the things that are on the list for today. So sometimes they go in the diary. So that's in a fifth to-do list. But they go in pencil, whereas the meetings go in pen. Because although they really have to be done today, they don't really have to be done today in the way that the meetings have to be done today, so they could still be moved. This is a very elaborate system of task management, essentially, that Juliet's developed. And she's developed it herself. She's developed it, I mean, it works for her, but it's different from everybody else's system. We have other data which explains people's decisions about moving back and forth between electronic diaries and paper diaries, and the pros and cons of keeping records on Outlook versus on paper. It is vanishingly rare for academics to have any kind of training in this kind of work, and yet a great deal of time is spent on this kind of meta-logistical organisation. And it's actually rare for people to learn from others. This kind of writing tends to be, at least in our data, it wasn't something that people had spoken to other people about a great deal. It was very much emerged from their own experience. But I wonder whether, as we are expected to be increasingly autonomous, self-managed professionals, there might be a place for some more explicit joint reflection on the kinds of writing systems for managing these kinds of tasks that work or don't work for people. The most commonly mentioned platform for writing in our data was email. And I think learning to manage email writing and email communication is a particular need in the academic world, and one which I don't think there's really an answer for it at the moment. But again, when people talked about how they learned to email, so how they learned kind of practices of email communication, but also learned quite simply the task of managing an overwhelming email inbox, again, tended to be things that people had developed on their own. And in this quote from Charles explains that he had 596 unread emails just before Christmas in an inbox of 14,000, and his strategy was to delete them all. and see what happened. And he found that nothing happened. A few people came back and said, you didn't reply to my email. And now he has a different strategy where he keeps 1 day a week solely for emails and manages them. He gets 60 to 80 a day, which is probably on the low side. Actually, I would say most of our people talk about dealing with about 100 pieces of correspondence a day, which is a huge task, and one which people are currently learning how to do almost entirely through experience. I think this lack of communication around email, in quite a profound contrast to the importance of learning from expertise, learning from others, getting feedback on your practices that we saw in relation to research writing and teaching writing, is problematic and very invisible at the moment, and it's one of the things that I'd like to look into a little bit in a little bit more detail as we write up the project.
Public engagement, and particularly public engagement through social media, represents a whole set of new genres and challenges that some of our participants were facing. So it's interesting to hear what people said about it in the data. And the data show a range of attitudes surrounding its use and how people became proficient at it. And there's a general consensus from our participants that social media writing in its various forms, whether it's blogging or tweeting, is now an established part of the many writing activities that academics have to contend with. But there isn't an agreement on how this should be done, when it should be done in terms of career stage, when it's best to do this sort of thing, and how it is learned. While some, as in Gareth's quote here, would like formal training in this area, there's also a kind of recognition from, as in Mark's quote underneath it, that access to appropriate training is not always easy to come by, and sometimes it's not even appropriate. Mark points to a kind of disjuncture between advocacy of social media and engagement on one side, and academics leaving things to their own judgment on the other side. And this has implications for learning because our participants didn't talked about no clear guidance on this. So for our participants, social media represents a radical restructuring of communication between academics and the rest of the world and the rest of their field. So there's an element of trepidation and excitement about it. And there are those who embrace it and teach themselves to blog and write and speak to other audiences, including one mathematician who takes it upon himself to do short talks in bars on chaos theory, Café Scientifique and things like that. And he also has a blog. Notably, he does these two things independently of his institution. And there are those, like Emma, who would rather wait till they're more established before they start saying anything in a blog post and to a public audience. Here, Emma talks about not having learned enough to warrant writing and talking about her work on social media. But the issue of learning to use social media brought no clear answer at all. But I'll just let you read Emma's long quote here. She talks about it being a form of brand awareness, as in the brand of my department, and my brand. And when the day dawns of anything published, it'll be all over Twitter. And yeah. So, but the issue didn't bring any clear answer. With academics on one side waiting for departments and universities to do something to train them to use social media, and other academics quietly just getting on with it and developing their own online identities and writing through social media on their own, independent of any institutional endorsement for it, much less any training and support for it. But the issue of learning to write with social media is one that's often dominated by or plagued by discussion and debate around different platforms, WordPress, Twitter, etc. A deeper question here is, what kind of scholar do you want to be? And do you want to engage with wider publics about your research? And it's here that we find a divergence between those people in our research who use social media and those who don't, and the different writing practices that they will engage in response to that question. Rather than learning about a particular platform, they started telling us about what kind of scholar they want to be, what kind of scholar they see themselves as in their discipline. So in short, we could say that the stance an academic has about social media and engagement is less about a particular platform and more about how they see themselves as a scholar. Overall, we can say that some of the key themes that have emerged from our study in relation to learning to write are as follows. There's the importance, and how are we for time?
Finding it. 20 past. We've got another 10 minutes.
All right, that's good.
Or extra time for questions.
Great. There's the importance of learning from others and the nurturing of and the relationships and collaborations with others and learning from those relationships and collaborations. This was really important in terms of learning to write, although less so in terms of personal administrative writing, more important in terms of research writing. It's one of the key themes to emerge from our data, the nurturing of positive and fruitful relations early in one's career as part of developing one's academic writing skills. Conversely, problems with writing often connected with problems of nurturing the right kinds of networks. What I mean is, if learning through collaborating is contingent upon an academic's ability to develop and sustain networks. Developing the capacity to build and nurture positive and useful networks of peers, colleagues, mentors, etc. is clearly of crucial importance in an academic's learning to write for research purposes. So we saw a lot of learning by doing as a central part of how academics learn to write. In all the areas that we looked at, one of the best ways to actually learn to write is to actually write and to start writing and to get feedback as you go along. But that links to the first point, that you need the peers and colleagues in order to get that feedback, in order to give you that feedback. So there's that aspect to it. There's an element of self-direction as well that's very important that we picked up on in the data. Where formal training was mentioned, it was frequently in relation to its flaws and weaknesses. It was most likely to be positively valued where it had facilitated learning by doing or learning from others. And the thread running through all of this was the importance for our participants of adopting a kind of can-do attitude or self-directing attitude, as Diane points out in the quote. To learn writing, you have to sort of sit there and do it yourself. Do you want to chip in?
No.
Okay. So what we'd like to do now is hand it over for some sort of discussion broadly around these three questions. How can academics best be supported in ongoing learning? What's the role of ongoing formal training? And are early career staff well prepared for the diversity and autonomy of academic work? Yeah, so it'd be great if we could have your views. And those people who are following the stream or even watching after when it's recorded, you can use the hashtag #AcadsWriting, which is what we sometimes use in our events to keep the conversation going online as well. I'll just move on to our blog, and I'll go back to discussion slide afterwards. But if you want to follow the blog, the project's progress, there's some brilliant reflections, most of them done by Sharon over here, on how the project has progressed and the kinds of obstacles we faced, and it gives you a really good sort of informal overview of the project. So you can follow that. I'll put it back to the discussion slide now. So those are the kinds of things that we'd like to discuss with you now as part of this talk.
Right. Thank you very much. Okay. That you've intimidated everybody.
The question on point 2 there. Was anybody ever positive about ongoing formal training? Did you get anyone go, I went to some ongoing formal training and it was really good?
That's a good question. I think, like I said on the in the admin section, where people, it did tend to be where people had gone to the training and learned from one another. Or Diane's point about the writing retreats, if you see writing retreats as a part of formal training, she'd seen that as a really important part of her development. So yes, there were, but I would say that where it was mentioned, it was predominantly in relation to its weaknesses. Dave?
Yeah, can I just pick up the point on the formal training? Is one issue maybe because we work in disciplines with very disciplinary-based language, disciplinary-based discourses, that something like a more generic thing, say writing for publication or writing presentations, is problematic because it's trying to be all things to all people?
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. I'm sure that's part of it, because in other aspects of what we've done, we've looked at the disciplinary specificity of people's writing, and real tensions emerged between the expectations around people's own, what they were doing as part of their disciplinary tradition, and the ways in which their writing was being assessed centrally, and similar things would apply, I think, to training which didn't reflect those traditions. Yeah.
As we mentioned, a lot of participants spoke about the informal feedback as the training, including the peer review, and including joining and getting becoming familiar with the community surrounding certain journals in order to publish within them. Meaning connecting with the people who are involved in those journals.
My question is kind of the opposite of the one about did anybody really like what they were doing? It doesn't sound like anybody's really struggling from your data. I don't get a sense that everybody's, although I know we are all drowning in paperwork and so on, but at the same time, academics quite like learning, obviously. They like learning how to do new things. They like doing different things. They like writing, actually, basically. So I wonder if there's any kind of bigger implications for people who are actually, well, I've got lots of questions here, I think. One is, are there particular things that you think need to be addressed? But the other thing is, are there implications for other sectors of society where those things don't come at all easily, and they haven't joined up to that game in the first place, and yet they're expected to do all kinds of reading and writing that they don't actually want to do just to survive. I mean, I know we have to do it to survive, but we've kind of signed up to that. Interesting.
Yeah, that is. I think in terms of that, the importance of peer support and networks, I mean, Ibrar particularly talked about that, is absolutely crucial. And when you think about people who are struggling with reading and writing in everyday life, the ways in which they manage it is often through informal networks, and where they don't manage it, it does tend to be where they don't have those informal networks to draw on. So facilitating that in some way, I think, is important. There are, of course, academics who struggle with these kinds of things. The methodological problem is that it's hard to recruit them to a project about academic writing. So I think you're right that most of our participants wouldn't be characterised as struggling, although overwhelm, particularly around administrative writing and email and some other kinds of expectations, did come out of the interviews. But we also had a lot of discussion of pleasurable things and challenges as well.
Thank you. Yanya had a question. Yes, please.
So, I'm wondering what's the relation between knowledge production and knowledge dissemination, if you will, particularly with networks and how people come about, and what is a writing practice, basically? Is it knowledge production or dissemination? Is there a difference in learning how to do this? And does it matter where you are in terms of your academic community or success? So, for example, publishing in the English language, if you're not in the English language country, does this matter? How do you learn how to do that? So I know that it's hard with your data because you're limited to your particular cases, but still. And then my second question was more about, so how do you interpret these practices in terms of the contextual facts that you discussed at the beginning, so the knowledge economy and the changing expectations and managerialism and so on? Did this affect these practices are now lived experience. I mean, how do you relate these two?
Well, if I've understood your question correctly, in many ways, one form of writing or one form of knowledge production can beget another form of writing and knowledge production. Like somebody can write an article and then have to write an abstract for that article, which has a different set of conventions and a separate, wider audience. And then they can write a blog post about their article, and then they can write a tweet about the blog post, and then they can write an email alerting their colleagues to the tweet that they've just sent. So you get this sort of chain of textual work, which is all producing knowledge in a slightly different way. What from a realist perspective would be the same piece of knowledge. And so if that's what, there's like a different layers of writing work for everything that we have to do now. People will write articles in the conversation about their research. It doesn't just stop with the prototypical journal article anymore. People are asked to write for the conversation on Times Higher and things like that. So these are, in the lived experience of academics, we've seen such a diversity of types of writing now that are part of an academic's working life, which are all related to the research, but also feed into dissemination as well. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it's hard to disentangle knowledge production and knowledge dissemination, really. I mean, like Ibrar was saying, that each representation, each text that's produced is a new construction of knowledge. And while you can probably look at some of the research-related genres that we identified as being kind of closer to knowledge production, and they don't circulate in the same ways, there is a kind of increasingly wide circulation of the of a lot of the different kinds of texts that we looked at, and so production and dissemination are very closely interlinked, and I'd kind of hesitate to pull them apart, really. And even when you're looking at the teaching, to be honest, that's still teaching isn't just the dissemination of existing knowledge. It's each time one of those course booklets is written, it's the creation of a new representation of a field and production of that kind of knowledge in a new way. So, yeah. In terms of your question about how the context affects the practices, I think the kinds of things we were talking about at the start, the changing relationships with students, increasing stress on producing written accounts of oneself, those kinds of things, they have I think they've affected academics' working lives in various ways. In terms of learning, there are constantly new kinds of texts that need to be written, that need reporting to different kinds of committees, different kinds of individuals, engaging with students in new ways, the changing relationship with students. I mean, if I'm writing the thing about a course outline now, we've now been, in my department, we have quite constrained ways of representing our courses on Moodle so that everything will be uniform. That's very different from the kind of freedom and autonomy we had a few years ago in how we represented things. And then all of that has to be tied in very closely to all the other kinds of representations. And that's really changed the nature of that kind of writing, and there's quite a lot of that. And I think the rapidity of change is another thing, that a lot has to be learned every year. There are new ways of doing things. And the volume of texts that are produced, I think, is probably greater as well.
Thank you. Jan, and then me, if it's all right. Mine's quite a niche question, so it's okay if you don't have an answer to it. And I was wondering, is when they talked about assessment as part of their activities, was there any discernible difference in sort of tone, outlook, approach?
Do you mean assessing students, or do you
mean, their role as, so the forms of writing involved with assessment, so giving feedback and summative.
What do you think?
I don't remember anything specifically. You mean a different tone of response?
Yeah, because certainly, well, when I've done work with academics, them on the subject of assessment, and typical responses are, this is the worst part of my job, this is the bit they have to pay me for, this is the really hard bit, and so on. And I was just wondering whether that had come out. And it's interesting if it hasn't.
There's bits in the data where people like mathematicians talk about having to write more teaching materials with more kinds of worked examples than they used to when, 20 years ago or whatever. And the reason is because of, related to assessment, the reason for them was because the students expect more worked examples in mathematical problems, because that's what they've had, that's the kind of assistance that they've had in assessment from school or etc. Whereas a particular mathematician has a certain understanding of maths, where he said that it's your own mathematical instinct that you've got to apply to a particular problem. It's not for me to give you a worked example. And so, related to assessment, there a different understanding of maths on the part of the student and the teacher there, and he's having to write a lot more in the way of teaching materials than he used to. And that's one thing that I think relates to your question, perhaps.
That's interesting.
Which is pulling him away from other work.
One of the institutions we worked for had recently moved to a system of providing feedback on assignments online. So it used to be that they could do it on the train, or they could sort of do that anywhere, and now they had to be at the computer to do it via this platform.
Yeah.
And that was, it wasn't universally disliked. People complained about it a bit, about the fact that it restricted where physically they could do that marking. But people weren't entirely against it, I wouldn't say. And my impression overall about assessment is that a lot of people talked about enjoying that kind of thing, actually. I didn't get the feeling, it's an anecdotal answer, but my impression wasn't that it was a source of particular stress, other than in some cases the switch to a digital form of doing it.
I wonder, though, whether there might be, again, a methodological thing there, in that the time when people are dealing with piles of marking, which, again, it tends to be about volume and overwhelm and having to do things for a particular time scale, is not the point in time when they would be happy to arrange interviews with us.
Yes.
That would happen at a different time of the year, and these things do tend to come in chunks, so that might have something to do with it as well.
Just one more. In our phase 2, as you might know, we record the writing events happening, which includes a video recording and a screen recording of the writing unfolding in real time. And one of our writing events is a PhD examination feedback, which is, a form of assessment. So we still have to analyse that thoroughly, that data yet, but we do have one whole piece of assessment event, if you like, recorded in its pretty much in its entirety.
I'll just quickly ask mine, hopefully, and then Nicola. I'm just thinking about how you draw a boundary around writing, because obviously it's multifaceted, multi-layered, all those things. I mean, if I think about my own sitting down writing, there's planning involved, there's some writing, there's the junctures where I stop and think, oh gosh, I don't know quite what's coming next. I mean, how are you actually drawing a boundary around what you call writing?
That's a good question. I would say that because we're kind of coming from a literacy studies approach, it's not, we would be taking quite an expansive definition of writing, and it would include, that's why we're talking about writing practices, so it would include actually people's feelings about writing, it includes people's values around writing, it includes this thing about how people are acquiring, developing different practices, as well as it's a very broad definition of writing. It's not the narrow, okay, we are keeping it only to the production of written text on paper.
Have you got a slide that shows that?
We should have a slide that shows that, shouldn't we? Yes, yes, we should.
It might help me understand why I stop so often. It's not this fluid thing,
Yeah.
Well, so in our coding, we have electronic as one element of the coding. A lot of people do writing. I mean, that's one way of looking at boundaries, physical. Then we've got cycling. That's when people get a turn of phrase as they're cycling, or they kind of they stop and write stuff down. So there's many ways, many instances where physical movement plays a part. That's one way of looking at boundaries. Then there's a time boundary. Then there's a boundary within the discipline and department, and ostensible boundaries in that way. So there's many ways of looking at boundaries as well.
Brilliant. Thank you. Nicola.
Thanks, I really enjoyed that, especially considering writing in all its forms, and it made me realise why I'm actually really exhausted. I'm wondering about, instead of thinking about the role of ongoing formal training, can your project help us to think about forms of resistance to the intensification of communication and the forms, you know, of writing that are expected in the neoliberal academy that put massive demands on people, and is there something within your project that can contribute to those debates, and you know, maybe you have some tips that you could contribute to the debates, like delete all your emails and things like that?
I think that's absolutely been one of the drivers of the project, a concern with the way in which some of these changes are exhausting people, and the invisibility of that exhaustion because of the invisibility of a lot of these writing demands. I mean, one of the things that we can do is to clearly articulate and describe. I mean, just doing things as simple as listing all the different genres somebody is engaging with over the course of a day makes that visible. Identifying the numbers of emails that people are dealing with every day makes that visible, and then at least it can be talked about in a concrete way that's going beyond our workloads are all overwhelming issue. So I would like our work to contribute to that debate, and certainly the papers and things that are coming out will be engaging with that debate, but I can't promise that we're going to overturn the neoliberal academy.
So we can't have that written into the workload. Yeah. I've emailed 100 people today, some of them 20 times.
I do think though the email thing. Some of the feedback I've had when we've talked about this in other spaces has been, well, what do institutions actually have a responsibility to engage with the specific thing of email, and to make expectations around email explicit, and around what's normal, because it's one of those things that people individualise, and actually bringing it out into the open and saying, well, this is how much time it's reasonable to spend doing this. This is how we as a department can make this manageable. So in our department, because I talk about this, the department, we usually have a research day once a year. And last year, instead of having a research day, we had a no email day, where a whole day where we weren't going to communicate with each other by email at all, and we could just focus on our own research writing for that day. And the head of department sent an email around before 8 o'clock that morning because she'd forgotten. And that has led to an explicit discussion in the department about having hours for email and hours not for email, which is now a kind of official policy, not that there are any sanctions associated with it, but at least it has been recognised as an issue. So part of it is making these things visible, and then they can be discussed.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think I don't know if we can address certain issues and give like tips and how-to guide or anything, but we can raise some of the issues. We can initiate some of that discussion around the amount of service genres that people are engaged in, and the importance of them, and factoring them into a workload a little bit more. The email management, as Karen has outlined, writing retreats and their utility and importance, and blocking out dedicated time for that sort of thing. We've already seen an interest in it already from the project. So we can perhaps contribute to that kind of resistance.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've identified is the importance of being able to put boundaries around time, and to challenge a kind of dominant narrative of continual production, and to identify the need to have longer spaces of time for particular kinds of writing is one of the things that came out really strongly.
I was just wondering if there were any interesting differences from the participants in terms of the sorts of institutions they worked at, in terms of maybe the conventions or the expectations around some of the things discussed around administrative writing or service writing.
There were certainly differences. The teaching intensive discipline had teaching intensive university. There was more central concern over the way the institution was represented in teaching materials, wasn't there? There was much more central control over that. But do you two want to?
I've been doing a lot of interviews this week and last week at Post 92 University, which is more teaching intensive and less research focused. And I've noticed that people, because the default position generally has been when you say, tell me about the writing that you do, people talk about the research writing because that's what's important to them. But at that institution I've noticed recently, particularly because I'm doing a lot, day after day, that they talk about their teaching, first of all, and I have to ask about their research, which is interesting. I suppose that reflects the relative value placed on those things by the institution. And people have said things like, well, we do have to do research on paper, like it's part of our contract, but there's a kind of acknowledgement that teaching has to come first, and that's sort of something to do if you can after you've done the teaching. So I think there is a difference a bit depending on the kind of institution that you're in.
Yeah, and that does affect the distribution of genres that people are writing, obviously.
Yeah, I've put that slide up in, to help with that answer. The post-92 university, as you can see, we had the fewest interviews because it was so hard to get in and talk to the staff. And also the cultures of writing. Once we did get into them, the cultures of writing was very much different to the different places, the other places.
I also have the feeling that post-92 university, people felt that they had quite a high burden of admin. A couple of people said that compared to previous places they'd worked, that there was a high admin burden. Of course, that's a subjective perception.
Yeah, I was wondering about that as well. If there was any sort of discussion of people who'd worked in different sorts of institutions, if their writing responsibilities were to change. Karen mentioned before about when a department might have particular conventions or sort of particular way you have to do things, and it takes a while to learn those things when you join a new department. I think sometimes it can take you quite a few years until you really understand all of those conventions and presentations.
I think there are definitely differences in terms of the amount of flexibility and autonomy people have from one institution to another. Also in terms of some departments and institutions have a very restrictive policy around publication for the ref, like in target journals. Others don't. So that varies depending on discipline but also institution.
Right, I think we can do a question in a second, Steve, but I think first of all, because Karen has to shoot off, then I think I'd like to say a warm thank you to both of you for presenting today. Do you, and then you can ask your questions, Steve. Okay, so just an early round of applause.
Thank you. I'm very sorry I have to go. I have to chair a session with one of my PhD students.
We've got a couple more minutes, so we should probably make this one the last. But Steve?
Yeah, I wonder if there's. It strikes me that academia is one of those areas where the pressures to engage in lots of different writing are increasing, but the valuing of those different writing isn't. So I wonder, were there any differences between different institutions over what writing was valued? So, there's this kind of thing where it's like, if it's not in a 4-star journal, it doesn't count, unless you're in a certain discipline, in which case a monograph might count higher. But yet you're supposed to also write in the conversation around, you're supposed to endlessly tweet and write about your 4-star journal, but actually, or were there any institutional differences? So if you are a lecturer, it's got to be 4-star journals, but if you're a teaching associate writing a course book is valued for promotion and so on, whereas it wouldn't necessarily. Are there any patterns that you've seen of, I don't know, resentment, value, discipline, organisation within that mass?
Well, there were differences at various levels. There's the differences from the sort of institutional level. A Russell Group University the Russell Group University, we visited has a certain understanding of how they want to handle the ref, and that is imposed on the staff at the departmental level. But individual academics also handle this slightly differently, depending on what stage in their career that they're at, and also things like the kind of scholar that they want to be. So you have people who are tweeting and blogging and doing seminars in cafes and bars on their own, without any institutional endorsement of it. There are differences in how different academics value the different kinds of writing, but there isn't really a fixed way of doing that, of us sort of theorizing that. There are just so many disparities in that kind of thing. In terms of, there were some departments where literally you would have a list of journals that they had to submit to, and the academics were told, you have to write in these journals, and anything else is supererogatory, it's extra, but don't prioritize those other things. This is what you need to. And then there were those where you didn't get that at all.
Is there anything with like open access with this as well? Did any of the debates and discussions about journals have no reason to exist into this anywhere?
Well, not open access, but the historians want to hold on to their monographs, and some of them spend 7 years writing a monograph. But then there are instances where people start using social media and then they change the way they view themselves in their discipline. So you'd have an historian who writes a monograph, tweets about it, it gets read by somebody in a different field because it's out in the open, and then that historian then says, I'm a historian, but my work is used by social scientists. And so the way that new kind of engagement has changed the way that historian talks about himself as a historian. So that's another way of looking at that as well. There's a closing down in some ways, and then there's an opening up in different ways. And different writing practices instantiate all those sort of different changes. So yeah.
I think there was a pattern in terms of people who were near the end of their career, like professors who were in their 60s already, were often more enthusiastic or did more sort of writing on blogs, tweets, social media than younger academics, and also said, and a couple of people said, I wouldn't recommend this to an early career researcher because first of all you have to get established and you haven't got time. And somebody else said, I want to do this kind of writing, that was referring to things like The Conversation or popular press, but it's not valued by the institution. So there's a bit of a tension in terms of the impact of public engagement writing, that's okay, you can do that as long as you've already got the 4-star papers. If you haven't got the 4-star papers, you can forget about all that. It doesn't matter how good your blog is. So that's kind of perceived as something extra on top of the core journals or journal articles, which are perceived as the ones that really count. Although you're encouraged, to do it, but it's kind of on your own time, right?
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you, Anita. Well, we are going to have to stop. So thank you again, Ibrar and Sharon, for also adding to the discussion. The next seminar, I'll go through these in order. Okay, a copy of the PowerPoint presentation video will be available soon on the Educational Research website. The room's available until 2:30, although Ibrar thinks he has the rest of the day to talk about it. And the next seminar will take place in this same room on Wednesday, the 16th of November, and it's with Yanya, and I don't know how to say your second name, Yanya. So thank you, thank you. And it's on making higher education markets. And the other final thing was just to say a kind of good luck to Ibrar, who's leaving Lancaster at the end of December, or the middle of December, on the 16th, to go to Queen's University Belfast to take up a lecturer post. Yep. Is that right? So
send us an email when you get there, mate.
So just wanted to say thank you and good luck to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.